Three, two, one. Oh, my finger hit the mic. That's a crazy waveform.
Welcome back, De Niro Nation, to our hero De Niro, the only podcast that is watching and recapping Robert De Niro's entire filmography in a random order, except for this week, because we are covering the brand new, still in theaters film, The Alto Knights, starring Robert De Niro in dual roles as gangsters Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. With me, as always, is my co-host, Mike.
Hello.
Exciting to talk about this one. Well, maybe exciting to talk about this one. Exciting to have a new De Niro project that we can see in a theater, you know?
And it's hopefully when we release this episode, it's going to come out on Tuesday the 25th. You stated still in theaters, and I mean, hopefully it still will be, because I can't imagine it's going to be in theaters for very long. It's not getting very good reviews, nor does it seem to be drawing many people to the theater.
I mean, it's March.
We went on Friday night at 8 p.m. It's got to be the biggest release this week besides Snow White, right? And there were maybe 9 people in the theater besides us at 8 p.m. Friday night, like the prime showtime. Doesn't bode well.
I want to talk, but you're going to give us a high level recap, but I want to talk a little bit about the context of this film. This is interesting just because this is a mob movie that is starring Robert De Niro, who's 85 or 86 at this point. And
oh my God.
What?
I want to talk about this too.
Well, I want to talk about the creative team here. So this film was directed by Barry Levinson and written by Nicholas Pileggi. Oh, God, how do you pronounce that name when there's the 2 G's?
It's probably Pileggi.
Okay. So Barry Levinson, he's 82 years old, and he directed Rain Man, Diner, Good Morning Vietnam, Wag the Dog, the Hulu miniseries Dope Sick. And then Nicholas Pileggi, he's a writer, and he wrote he co-wrote the screenplay for Goodfellas, which came out in 1990, and he is 92 years old. So the creative team here, to me, it felt a lot like everyone just wanting to do one last mob movie with De Niro. Yeah, hey, we can get him in for one, and hey, he wants to do 2 roles for some reason or whatever. I wonder whose idea that was. And we'll talk all about how successful that is later on. But yeah, this is a pretty low budget movie, relatively speaking, mid-budget, $45 million. It's too early to really see how the box office performance is going to, end up, but it doesn't seem like too big of a smash hit at this point.
Yeah, I think I read on maybe yesterday afternoon or something that the receipts had come in for the first couple days and it only made $1.6 million. So it's not looking great for the opening weekend.
Damn. Well, they all made their money. So yeah, we saw this in the theater last Friday at 8 p.m. And because of that, we couldn't take any notes. So Mike's going to give us a high level overview of the plot of the film. And then I think we'll just have a conversation about it. And this should probably be our shortest episode yet. So I think that'll, be interesting to see how we do.
All right, let's get right into it. So it opens up, and something about the way this movie is structured is that it does, narration as its kind of primary narrative device in a way that feels like it's paying homage to Goodfellas, but it doesn't do it well. The narration is really awkward and really poorly written. It's delivered by De Niro playing the Frank Costello character. And so the essential thrust of this film is you've got these 2 mobsters, Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, both of whom are played by our man Robert De Niro, our hero De Niro. And they grew up together. They've been friends since they were kids. And when they got into kind of their late teens and into their 20s, they started getting involved with the rackets and eventually became high-ranking figures in organized crime. I think that in real life, right? This isn't depicted in the film, but in real life, kind of at the time when a lot of this stuff in the film is happening, they'd kind of risen up in their own respective roles in this family that they were a part of. And Genovese was underboss, which is the kind of number 2 in a mafia family, and then Costello was consigliere, which is. It's sort of like a second number 2 role, but it's not necessarily a role that's doing the things that are happening or enforcing or making decisions necessarily, but it's really kind of like a principal advisor role. And they were both working for the head of the mob at the time, who was Luciano. I can't think of his first name.
Charles.
It was the Luciano family. Charles Luciano. Yep. So anyway, that's kind of the context of what's happening here. And so these guys have known each other for their whole lives. And the thrust of the film is it's about this war that's happening between the two of them. And so the film opens and you've got De Niro giving this voiceover, and he's Frank Costello in this delivery, and he's talking about his life and the way that he's tried to live. You know, he's tried to be a more businesslike, more honorable, more kind of studious sort of mobster. Focused more on strengthening political connections and using more subtle, less violent methods to make the organized crime work. And then on the other end of it, you've got Vito Genovese, who is also played by Robert De Niro, who's depicted as more of a hothead, more of kind of a violent psychopath, very dangerous, seems like a really terrible guy. And so the kind of beginning of the film, the inciting incident for the film is Costello is out with his wife, and they're seeing a show, and they want to go somewhere else afterward, but he says that he has to run home, so they separate. And he lives in this very upscale penthouse at the top of some, building in Manhattan. And as he's walking into the building to get into the elevator, go up to his penthouse apartment, somebody comes in and shoots him in the head. And this assassination attempt, in spite of him having been shot in the head, is not successful. He survives. The doctor says something very odd that I did not look into the historicity of, but I found this line really funny. When he's in the hospital afterward, the doctor's like, yeah, the bullet should have gone into your head, but it actually bounced off of your skull and went around it.
Yeah.
But that actually happened? That doesn't really make any sense. I feel like he just missed.
Right. He says that it miraculously curved around his head or something. It grazed his scalp and curved. What is this? The movie Wanted? How is that possible?
So he survives. And he knows what's happened, right? So the cops they come to speak with him. And a big thing about him is he's very in the shadows about the fact that he is a very senior figure in the mob. So the way that he's a pretty famous dude. But the context in which he is pretty famous is primarily as a philanthropist, as a real estate guy, as somebody who ostensibly makes his money in gambling. He's a professional gambler. And so people know who he is. He's a relatively well-known person at the time, but the general public is not aware that he is a mobster. And so it's very important to him that he kind of keeps attention away from the fact that he is a part of this kind of graft, and keeps attention on his philanthropy and the things that he wants to be known for. And so the cops come to question him. They're like, hey, you obviously saw the person who shot you. You must know who it was. Who was it? But he doesn't tell them, even though he knows that it was this gentleman, Vincent Gigante, who works for Genovese. And so he's just trying to kind of keep things calm after this happens. He doesn't want to draw law enforcement attention to what's happened. He doesn't want to foment kind of this more violent, more open war with Genovese. He just kind of wants to handle this pretty quietly. And so then we go back. So this is kind of it's sort of a little bit of media res, I guess, the way that it's depicted. So we then go back, and he explains more via the narration and via what's shown on the screen, kind of what led to this happening. So what happened was essentially they grew up together, they were friends, but as they grew into adults and developed their kind of professional identities as mobsters, their paths diverged, in terms of what their managerial styles were, what kinds of things they thought it made sense for the family to be involved with. And so, like I said earlier, Genovese, he's a violent piece of shit, very paranoid, very prone to emotional outbursts in a very violent way. We see this happen many times throughout the film. He's frequently killing and hurting people just because he either in a totally conspiratorial, insane way suspects that they're trying to undermine him, or because they've slighted him in some small way, to which the violence that he affects on them is not at all proportional. Whereas, Frank is depicted as being just he's obviously doing terrible things and involved with a lot of criminal enterprise, but he seems like a pretty normal guy. He's got a wife, he does normal things. He has dogs. He tries to resolve his conflicts in non-violent ways. And so they diverged in this way. Because of this divergence, Genovese was involved more directly in a lot of violence, whereas Costello really wasn't. And so eventually, Genovese gets picked up for a couple of murders, and he flees the country. And so he goes overseas somewhere where he's not going to get extradited, and he essentially goes into hiding for a few years and comes back when something has happened. I think like a witness was killed or something. It's explained only vaguely in the film, and like you said, we didn't take any notes, so I don't remember all the specifics. But I think that he manages, or his folks back in the United States managed to kill like one witness who was going to be like a major linchpin in the government's prosecution of him. And so he comes back after being in exile overseas for many years and goes to trial, and he wins because the state doesn't have anything really to introduce as evidence against him. So he gets off on a double murder rap. But I think it had been like maybe a decade, like maybe 10 or 12 years since he'd fled. And so the entire structure of the organization has changed. He was previously the one who was in charge. He was a more kind of senior ranking member in the organization. Costello's taken that over in his absence. And Costello is running things in a very different way than he would have wanted to run things. And also, he doesn't have any way to earn anymore. You know, all of his territory has been subsumed by other members of the family, and the entire structure of the business has changed, you know, in the time that he's been gone. And so when he comes back, they come into conflict with one another, and the conflict is essentially that Genovese doesn't feel like the infrastructure is in place for him to be taken care of, and a way that he sees to do that is by getting involved with narcotics distribution.
Yeah,
and this is a very big thing that happened in the late 40s and into the 50s in mafia culture. And this is a big part of kind of what is depicted and fictionalized in the story of The Godfather, was this kind of this ongoing schism between more conservative, more kind of business and politics focused mobsters who wanted to stay away from things like drugs that were obviously going to draw a lot of federal attention in a way that is not profitable, and other, I think, more profiteering sorts of leaders who just wanted to roll the dice and try to get involved with these kinds of things, even though they were dangerous and were likely to attract a lot of negative government and public attention. So they've got this disagreement, and it just kind of continues to simmer throughout the course of the film. While this is happening, still nobody knows that Frank Costello is a mobster. And during this period of time when their kind of conflict is rising in intensity, Genovese gets married to a lady, and they have like a very tumultuous, very passionate relationship, and ultimately get separated. And because so much of the money he makes is off the books, there is no way for her to sue him for the alimony that she's owed. And he's doing some kind of shady stuff, like pilfering money from a business that she owns totally separately from him as well. So she takes him to court and comes out and says, like, you know, he's acting all modest and like he doesn't have a lot of money or whatever, so he's not having to pay me any alimony. But actually, this guy is like a multimillionaire mob boss, and you should make him pay me, essentially. And while she's giving her testimony, by name, she implicates Costello, not in anything specific, but she says that they're close friends, essentially. And so this draws attention to Costello. It's like, hey, this Genovese guy's being accused of being a mobster, and in the accusation, he's being tied directly to this other person who's pretty famous, who we all know about. And so there end up being a lot of stories and a lot of press about how Frank Costello is actually a mobster. There are a set of congressional hearings, and everybody in the mob pleads the fifth, except for Costello. He goes and he answers a lot of questions in relatively non-specific, not super incriminating ways toward him or any of his fellow mafia folks. But you know, that wasn't done. You don't talk about the mafia, right? Like, the rule about the mafia is, and this is not, you know, this was really a thing in like kind of the early half of the 20th century when nobody really knew that the mafia existed. But like, especially at that time, it was like, you don't talk about it. Like, if you were a mobster and if you were asked something about the mafia, you would not answer that question. You would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, there's no such thing as organized crime.
It's a lot like Fight Club in that way.
Right. That was kind of like the going strategy, was just like nobody who was a part of it would even acknowledge its existence, let alone share any details about it. And that kind of like relatively ironclad agreement that everybody who was involved had to never acknowledge its existence really protected organized crime from a lot of scrutiny in the early half of the 20th century. And ultimately, the involvement with drugs was what drew a lot of federal attention, and ultimately, I think, really changed the culture of the American mob in the latter half of the 20th century. So he testifies. and the tensions between them continue to simmer and seem like they're poised to ultimately boil over. And Costello, at this point, he just kind of wants to get out. Like, he's like, I've made my money. It seems like the organization is moving in a direction toward more violence, toward more of these kinds of criminal enterprises that are going to draw negative public and government attention. And just like, I just want to hang out with my wife and my dogs, and I'm going to leave. And so he arranges this meeting. And so the structure of the mob in the first half of the 20th century was a little bit more centralized, I think, than it became in the second half of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So there were different federated, I guess you describe them as almost franchised families that existed in municipalities across the country. And in really large municipalities like New York, there would actually be multiple families. So like each borough would have like a family or two who kind of owned that territory and did the organized crime and racketeering in those areas. But there was a kind of hierarchical structure, almost like the government, kind of managing the operations in those different municipalities. And it all rolled up to one person who was the head of the Mafia Commission, essentially, who they colloquially refer to as the boss of bosses. And so Costello is playing this role at this point in the movie. He's risen to be like the top ranking person in the United States mob. And he's going to get out. And so the way that he's going to handle it is he's going to hand that role over to Genovese. Like, that's what they're really warring over, is like who is going to run the mob in the latter half of the 20th century. And so he arranges this meeting of all of the mafia leaders from across the country in this some kind of place in upstate New York. So they arrange this meeting up at a farm in upstate New York. And through essentially a comedy of errors, police attention is drawn to the existence of this meeting. And the cops end up pulling over and like taking down the plates and information of like everybody who's at the meeting, even though they weren't doing anything wrong. Costello notices that this is happening because he's running late. It was kind of unclear to me, like whether I think he did, right? Because he kind of called the cops and like teed them off to this.
Yeah, he tipped them off.
Yeah. So Costello has tipped the cops off to the fact that this meeting is happening. And so he kind of sandbags it, stopping to like buy some fruit and like take
really
a piss
funny.
and have
All
a
the
cup of
stalling that
coffee.
happens.
Like,
yeah.
And so he never makes it to the meeting. And so he is the only mobster who is not formally implicated by the cops doing the sweep. And so ultimately he's able to get out scot-free. A ton of attention is drawn to the mob. This really happened in real life. And this, plus the involvement with illicit drug distribution, was what drew a lot of federal attention to organized crime and the role that it was playing in American society, and ultimately led to, to its downfall, right? I mean, when I was growing up, I grew up in an Italian family. When my grandparents would talk about their lives, kind of growing up in Buffalo, New York, they were never involved with the mob, but the mob was just like a fixture. Like in the 50s and 60s, like it was just like a part of their lives. Like they knew the mobsters who were around town in Little Italy. And like, that's not the way that things are anymore. And, this set of events that took place really kind of were the beginning of the end for institutionalized, organized crime kind of across America. And now it's splintered. And obviously we do still have a lot of organized crime, but it doesn't behave in this nature. I think that it did 70 or 80 years ago when these things were happening. And so ultimately, Genovese is arrested and goes to prison and dies there. I think he dies of like congestive heart failure or something like that, like maybe after having been in the can for a decade or so. And Costello gets away. He like grows up into old age and just like dies of natural causes, and that's the end of the story, essentially. And so it's like this kind of meandering tale of this thing that happened between these two people, both of whom are played by Robert De Niro, leading to this like very important historical event that augured this sea change in the way that organized crime was done in the United States.
It's a great recap, man.
Thanks, man. I did it from memory. I didn't write a single thing down for that.
Neither did I. To talk about the theater experience a little bit, Mike and I last year, we did our year of IMAX where we saw every film released in our local IMAX theater, which was wonderful. And, we got used to there being 20 minutes of commercials or whatever, trailers before the film started. This film was not in our local IMAX. That was taken over by Snow White, the live action remake.
It seems like a great film.
So we saw it in one of the regular theaters, and I just have to say, one, there were 35 minutes of commercials and trailers before the film started. For a 2-hour long movie. This movie is only 2 hours long, and I want to talk about the length in a little bit too. But two, I was fucking losing. I'm glad I wasn't taking notes on my phone. I was losing it because sometime during the first act, we were sitting like more towards the left side of the theater in the sparsely populated theater. And at one point during the first act, 2 theater employees just like were hanging out in the aisle, like at the end of our row. And we're just having a full conversation. And it was the funniest fucking thing during like the quiet scenes of the Alto Knights, hearing them just talk at normal volume. And every now and then like their radios would go off. It was so fucking funny. It's just, yeah, you're hearing the beeps or whatever. It's like, I was just thinking like, why are you not having this conversation out in the hall? Like, why do you want to watch 5 minutes of the Alto Knights?
Yeah, I feel like this theater experience was so illuminating for me. That wasn't even the thing that I noticed, to be honest.
Oh, what did you notice?
There's this acknowledgement I think that people make that like the average moviegoer's etiquette has become like so terrible in a way that would have been inconceivable even like 10 years ago, right? Like people using their phones in the movie theaters, people talking, like whatever. And, you know, when you and me go to the movies, right, which we do a lot, we must have gone to the movies 65 times last year. We go to IMAX and we go to our local art house theater, right? And so like last year when we went to the movies a lot, I was like, man, it really seems like this diagnosis that we're making of the way that people are behaving when they go to the movies is like a little bit uncharitable to moviegoers, because we rarely saw that kind of behavior when we went to the movies last year. And the way that people were behaving and there was terrible. Like, yeah, to your point, the employees were annoying, but like I heard someone have a phone conversation on their cell phone during the movie. I heard people's phones go off multiple times. There were multiple times where like people who were in the theater were just having conversations with each other in a way that was like totally audible to me. And I was just thinking like, well, having gone to IMAX, which is more expensive and I think would attract like maybe a slightly more serious cinephile just because it's you know,
right,
a little bit more of an elite, like more expensive movie-going experience, and going to our local art house theater is not exposing us to the modal moviegoer. You know, and I think that like that really insulated us from the way that like the general public,
I never thought about that,
is behaving when they go to the movies right now. Like it's fucking crazy. Like
there were only 9 people in the theater.
There were so many disruptions in only a 2-hour movie. It was like. It was crazy. I'm glad I didn't care about the movie more. I would have been really, really pissed if it had been something that I was like super emotionally invested in and I like kept getting interrupted by these people acting like buffoons. It's like, what's wrong with you people? What are you doing?
Yeah, I'm glad I wasn't, super engaged with the film. I have like a checklist of things that I want to bring up in no particular order.
Right.
I think we should start off with De Niro here. So we don't have a time code for when he first appears on screen, but it's very early in the film, like 15, 20 seconds in, and he's
under a minute. Very, very early.
And he's in basically every scene, either as Frank or as Vito, which is great. But, it's such an interesting creative choice to have him play dual roles as these best, former best friends and now adversaries. And I just, I want to know, what did you think of that? Did it work for you? Did it not work? How'd you feel about it?
Yeah, it actually really did work for me. I thought that they were really judicious with the makeup and the costuming in a way that did make them look pretty different. So in the Costello role, he has like a pretty crazy prosthetic nose, which is like the big distinction between the two of them. And I remember until Vito came on the screen for the first time, when you first see De Niro for the first few minutes, you're only seeing him in the Costello role. And I was like, man, De Niro didn't look this ugly in 0 Day. Like, I feel like that must have been filmed pretty soon before this one. Like, his face has gotten like a lot like older and more strange looking than I remembered since the most recent contemporary thing that we watched him in. But it's just a very long prosthetic nose that makes him look a little odd, not quite like himself. So I think that worked well for me. And I do think that his range and versatility from an acting perspective shows in this film, because they really do feel like very different people in terms of like their speech mannerisms and the way they carry themselves, like even just beyond the makeup and costuming. Like he does a good job of playing them very differently, even though they inhabit the same world and they're being played by the same actor. So like, I don't know. I think as a device, I don't love this, just like in general, but I think that he did about as good a job with it, and it worked about as well as it could have for me, considering that they were doing this for some reason. Like, I don't know why you would ever do this, honestly.
That's the thing about it, is because I completely agree with you. I thought both of the characters are very distinct. I thought he did a great job in both roles, but the entire time I was just thinking like, what was the point? Like, whose idea was this?
It is pretty funny.
It's just, yeah, it's such a conceptually funny idea. We're gonna load him up with prosthetics and make him play both leads.
And he's also like one of the 5 most famous, most recognizable actors who's like working today. Like it's not like he's like maybe like a slightly smaller like figure who like maybe you wouldn't recognize. It's like no matter how you make up Robert De Niro, like everybody's gonna recognize him. He's Robert De Niro. Everybody knows who he is. It's pretty funny. But it worked for me, as well as it possibly could have.
Well, you know, speaking of Zero Day, because that is obviously that's his most recent project before this came out earlier this year. We've already talked about it at length, but I was thinking about that in terms of like the feel of the movie and the film's cinematography. So how did you feel about like the look and feel of this film overall?
I didn't like it at all.
Oh, really? Yeah, okay.
No, I really didn't. Yeah.
Why not?
I didn't like the way that it was colored. I didn't think that there was anything particularly interesting or creative about the way it was shot. And the way that it was edited was like mystifying to me. There were many points when the ways that scenes were cut together or shot just like completely took me out of the experience. The most dramatic thing that I can think of that like really struck me as kind of clumsy was the way that it used fade outs. Did you notice this? There were like 3 that made me laugh.
Yeah, I noticed. Well, I think cinematography and editing are 2 different conversations here.
Well, cinematographically, like I guess I don't really think much about it, to be honest. Like,
so you didn't like the coloring though? You didn't like the way they graded it?
No, I really didn't. No, I noticed it. I don't really like when I notice it.
Interesting.
Did you notice it?
I mean, I noticed it, but I kind of liked it. It's a very cool, like color grading, but I liked the look of it. I liked the cinematography, and I was comparing it in my head to Zero Day, like really almost unintentionally, but very favorably towards the Alto Knights.
Oh, sure. Compared to Zero Day.
I was comparing the look of this film, The Alto Knights, to that of Zero Day, which has that classic like Netflix original House of Cards style of cinematography. And I realized like, oh, like for those shows, what they do is, and I think they've tricked us into thinking that it's like a prestigious look or whatever. All they do, these Netflix shows like House of Cards or Zero Day, is they buy like the world's sharpest fucking digital cameras that shoot at like, they feel like they shoot at like 12K like fucking resolution.
Like, yeah.
And so the picture's super sharp. But then they dial down the saturation and they don't do any fucking like lighting. So everything just looks muddy and dark. And then they like have tricked the television watching populace into thinking like, oh no, this is prestigious. This is, yeah, exactly. Yep. And it's not, it just looks like a TV show now. And so I actually appreciated watching the Alto Knights and having this feeling that like, oh, this looks like a film. In a very I'm being very complimentary towards it. Like it feels like these. I just assume everyone who worked on this film was old based on the creative team, but it felt like oh, these are like actual craftspeople who are putting some level of effort into the look and feel of this film. However, yeah, to your point, the editing is a mess. This is only 2 hours long, and it's all over the place. And like the only way I could describe it is some parts of the film felt very cinematic to me in the way that they were like shot and edited and kind of like, you know, projected to the audience. But other parts felt like an episode of The Office.
Right, it's just shot, reverse shot, like really weird.
Well, and the framing device of this narration, because we're actually getting narration from De Niro. No, De Niro. That's not helpful when he plays 2 characters.
We have to say which character it is. Yeah,
we're getting narration from Frank at two different points, apparently. Like, some of the narration is coming from him in his like study, and he's looking at old film slides like on a projector, and he's just kind of talking about them. But then other narration is coming from him in his garden at, I guess, a different point, but they both seem like they're at the same point.
Yeah,
But
I found it very confusing.
it's shot like a mockumentary. And I was just thinking, like, it's shot like an episode of The Office or Parks and Rec. And I was just thinking, like, why are they doing this? Because so much of the film is just given to us with long bouts of narration from Frank. And I'm just like, and it had me wondering, like, is this a film that they were trying to save in editing? Was it like a studio mandate from Warner Brothers? Like, hey, we really want to keep this as close to 2 hours long as possible. Oh, okay, we'll just cover a lot of things in narration. And it makes the narrative feel disjointed because I like the idea of this film, the way that it was, because I didn't really know anything about it going into it. I wanted to go in as fresh as possible. And I liked the idea that it was setting up, that it was setting up this like really, this simmering gang war, and that it was going to boil over in New York and like result in all sorts of chaos and violence and bloodshed and whatever. But the way that it's edited, it kind of feels like it's starting and stopping and just kind of moving from scene to scene in a way that didn't feel like it was flowing naturally, especially with like you have congressional hearings, you have Vito, you have this entire arc with Vito meeting his wife, who is played by Catherine Narducci, aka Charmaine Bucco from The Sopranos. But you in the course of like 20 minutes, you have him meeting her, marrying her, and then like getting separated from her. And it's so weird just how it is kind of like playing out over the course of the 2 hours. They're cramming so much in there, but they're not doing it in an elegant way. And so that kind of took me out of the film a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. For me, the narration, I think it was particularly awful. It's maybe the most egregious thing about the film. And I think that what makes the narration so egregious is that it makes a lot of very explicit statements about what's happening with these characters and what has happened and the history is describing and what the feelings were that folks were having, that really draw your attention to the fact that none of this is depicted on screen. Yeah. Like the weakest thing about this, it's really an incredible failure of storytelling, is that like I like never cared about their relationship at all. Like it's like he talks about how much they like how close they were and how much they enjoyed spending time together when they were kids. But like it's really hardly ever shown, and like nothing about the way the characters are depicted together at any point in the film conveys like any chemistry or like emotion between them at all. And then in the final act, there's this scene of them talking together in prison. When they're both imprisoned afterward, and he says in the narration, he's like, oh, it was like so nice for us to like spend this time peacefully together, like even though like we'd had this war that led to the fact that now we're both imprisoned and like, you know, Vito's gonna die of congestive heart failure. And I was just thinking while I was watching it, like, yeah, it'd be really cool if I cared about this. Like I feel like it can be very emotionally affecting that these two characters are like old dying men, and they've made this like kind of grudging peace with each other, even though the like mistakes they've made and the violent war they had have led to these like difficult circumstances that they're in. And it's like, I don't give a shit. It's just like Robert De Niro talking to himself. Right? Well, it's like so amazing.
Yeah, it's Robert De Niro talking to himself. Well, it's funny you say that, because I was thinking during that scene, it's towards the end, and you see them sitting in one of their cells talking to each other, and Frank is narrating over it saying, yeah, it was really nice to talk to him and like blah, blah, blah. And I was just thinking, it would have been I would have been much happier with that if we had heard any of the conversation, or if they had ended on that conversation, like as a little like coda to everything that had happened previously. And you're right. Like, you don't care about their relationship that much. You're told, you know, as they say,
were best friends. He says it like 4 times.
Right. And you see, they do a lot of like kind of flashbacks with old style photos and things like that. So you see photos and little snippets, like just a few seconds of a time, at a time, of Frank and Vito as young men. but it's not enough. It's not enough to like cement the relationship and make it, sad for us as the audience when everything goes to shit. And I was pretty disappointed by it because I thought the casting for the young versions of Frank and Vito was great. Frank especially, I thought really looked like a young De Niro. And I was like, oh, it would be cool to see, right, in the first act, show the buildup, show them coming up as like young men or whatever. Give us something like that. And then...
Or throughout. Interspersed thematically aligned experiences they had together as kids with stuff that's happening in the present day to like draw a contrast, right? Like this is like screenwriting 101. Like,
the writer hasn't written a film in 35 years. Cut him some slack.
He's actually was in cryostasis and they woke him up to write this movie and he was his brain wasn't fully online yet.
So I thought that was a failing of the film. It was like make us care about them and make the downfall of the relationship more tragic. Instead, it just didn't really do that, and we got all of this narration over a 2-hour period. It was really bizarre. It felt like the sort of thing that they were trying to save in post, and I do wonder if that was like a deliberate, like they really thought that played well. I don't know. It was just kind of weird to watch.
It's just really odd. I feel like it only needed like 1 or 2 scenes. Like it would not have been difficult. I'm sure in the actual history of these real people, they could have identified 1 to 3 things that happened to them when they were kids that they could have like dramatized and put on film as like a 90-second to 3-minute scene of, to your point, the like well-cast younger actors who were playing the younger versions of these people. Like, I don't know. That would have been cool. Wouldn't have been that hard. I'm not really sure why they didn't do it.
Another issue here with the relationship between Frank and Vito is they only have a couple of scenes together, and there are a couple of points throughout the film where they meet, they sit down, and it's a classic one-on-one, talking about whatever their grievances are with each other. And they do it earlier in the film when Vito returns to America from Italy, where he was basically like isolated there for a while, like post World War II. So like he wants to get back in the game, and he's pretty bitter towards Frank, and they have a conversation then. And there's another one later on once, Vito is dealing narcotics and doing all this shit that's bringing heat down, and Frank's pissed at him and they're pissed at each other. And the writing of the film, like the script, it's like, it's fine, it's serviceable, but there was nothing really memorable about it. And I was comparing this unfavorably after I watched it to Heat, which is, one of the all-time great crime films. And that's one of the 4 films that De Niro and Pacino starred in together. And in Heat, they only share the screen for like 5 minutes. There's only one scene of them like actually talking to each other, that famous diner scene. But that conversation, it's so packed with meaning. You learn so much about the characters and like their perspectives on the world. Exactly. Like it's like the fulcrum point of the entire film, the 3-hour-long film. And you don't get anything like that when Frank and Vito talk. It's just Frank's always like, oh, Vito, you're doing these things, and you gotta stop doing these things. It's bad if you're doing these things. It's gonna be bad for everyone. And then Vito's just like, well, I gotta do these things, Frank. You
think you're so, do it.
Yeah, you think you're so good because you
get narration from Frank, and he's like, this is when I could tell that I was never gonna convince Vito to stop doing those things.
It's like, so what kind of the conversations are so unmemorable, right?
Because like the narration of that is like, it's so emblematic of like what we're talking about, because like there's actually nothing conveyed in the scenes in what they said or in their body language or their chemistry and anything that would convey to the viewer that like, oh, this was a turning point, and like now he knows he would never be able to convince him, so he has to say it in the narration, because otherwise we would never know it as viewers. Like it's like everything has to be described explicitly in the narration, because there is nothing happening in the story to make you know any of this stuff. Like it completely fails to use the storytelling strengths of film to like convey stuff about the characters to the viewer. It's really something.
Yeah, there's very little subtext in those conversations where you should really be like diving into the psyches of these characters and why Frank wants to be perceived as this noble whatever community member, and versus Vito who is more comfortable in this life as a gangster or whatever. It's just the contrast. There is a contrast there, but we're not like learning anything interesting about them. Instead, we're just getting Frank narration.
And this makes me reflect too on, why I think it would have been of so much value and so important for them to do some depiction of the younger versions of themselves. Because if I want to give some credit to the creative folks here, it's probably hard to convey that when you have the same actor playing both characters, because they can't actually film these scenes together. And so I thought we were watching these scenes and they're failing. It's like, okay, like I get that. That's really tough. And I think Robert De Niro is doing an admirable job considering the limitations of this very strange creative choice they made to cast him in both of the main roles. So like, okay, then why not use two people who actually are different to convey some of the subtext? Like, it's just like they had a method available to them. They did cast two separate actors as these characters at a different point in their lives. There was nothing stopping them from like using those folks to do this. It's like, it's all very odd. I'm not sure.
Well, so that's everything I had on my checklist. I mean, should we get into final ratings?
Yeah, sure. I don't really think I have anything else I want to say. I did write some stuff down earlier, but I think that it's just kind of all been covered organically through the course of the conversation. So yeah, let's do it.
Sure. What would you give the Alto Knights out of 5?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's tough. I think it fails creatively, but I liked it. You know, I mean, I said this to you when we walked out, right? Like, I mean, I didn't know most of this stuff. Like, I think I knew at a high level who these people were. And that this archetype of like the like violent moron who wants to get involved with drugs versus the like more reasonable politicking, like kind of manipulative businessman was an important archetype that informed like, you know, famous mafia movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas and stuff like that. Like that's a trope, right? And like that trope has historiosity to it. So like I knew that, but I didn't know any of this stuff. And so, like, I was pretty engaged. Like, I was really locked in. I enjoyed the film as much as I think it failed creatively. Like, I think that, you know, I enjoyed it just because it's an interesting story, and I wanted to see what would happen. I was excited to see how this was all going to turn out. And so I got to round up for it a little bit because of that. And so I think for me, 3 stars is where I'm landing on this one. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I think I'm also giving it 3 stars. It's well,
you got a rationale that's different from mine, or do we just have like the exact same rationale too? That would be very funny.
It's just my rationale is simple. I think it's an interesting story. You know, it's like based on true events. It's 2 hours long. It's pretty tight.
Yep.
I liked the look of it. I loved just seeing De Niro in both roles. I thought he did great.
He's great. Yep.
I think where it fails is overuse of narration. It meanders a bit. It doesn't feel necessarily like it's building to anything for a while. But overall, I had a decently fun time watching it. I lightly enjoyed it. You know, 3 is a soft like. So yeah, sure, I enjoyed it. 3 stars, better than average. Nothing great.
Yeah, sure. It's a nice little film.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would like to recommend instead of or in addition to the Alto Knights this week?
Yeah, I have something. I'm just, I never really think about it as an instead of or in addition to, but I guess that is an important distinction. So, a little peek behind the curtain here. I made this decision about 56 minutes ago. We've been recording for 51 minutes. But I was going through my list of films I've watched in the past few years, and I was thinking, like, what are some historical fiction, like ersatz thrillers that I've enjoyed that I've watched over the past few years that I think cut a contrast to this in terms of like how effectively they convey the story and the people who were involved in these events. And so I would like to recommend David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac. It is also a work of historical fiction. It is about the Zodiac killer. And I think that the way that it tells the story, I mean, David Fincher is an exceptionally competent director. And so there's a lot more creative competence, I think, on showing here than there is in Alto Knights. But the way that it chooses to convey the like central tension of what's happened here and like really make you invested in the fear and the trauma and the uncertainty of what's taking place it has a few different dimensions to it. So one, Zodiac tells its story as a story of like, or as a set of like very tightly connected, but in effect, vignettes. The different killings that took place, the involvement that the journalists and the investigators had with following up on those killings, works really, really well, and has a kind of narrative through line that Alto Knights fails to like ever establish at any point. And it also does a lot of showing. Whereas Alto Knights does not. And I think that, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I don't think you said it explicitly. And so I just want to call it out, right? Like, I think you meant to imply this, but we didn't say it in exactly these words. There's a lot of talk about like all the violence and stuff and like this war and like how costly it is. And I think you see like maybe 2 people get killed. Like they don't show anything. Like, there's no, like, dramatic buildup or, like, tension. There aren't, like, these big, like, explosions of violence where you're like, oh, my gosh, the stakes are so high here. But then, strangely, it also isn't, like, a quiet, cerebral film where it would kind of make sense to depict, like, so little of what was actually happening. And so, in that way, it, like, utterly fails. And so I would suggest Zodiac as, like, an excellent depiction of historical events that I think is... Alto Knights was trying to make us feel, I think, some of those feelings, like relate to the humanity of like these horrible people who do horrible things, and kind of get people to engage a little bit more specifically with famous but often tokenized historical events, right? Like the mob in the 50s and 60s, serial killers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I think you guys should watch Zodiac if you've never seen it. It's a pretty awesome movie.
Oh, yeah, that's a great recommendation. David Fincher is probably my favorite director, and Zodiac is a 5-star film, incredible film. It is 3 hours long, so you gotta be ready to commit to it, but it's really incredible.
Yeah, you want to know something? It feels shorter than Alto Knights, honestly.
Yeah. I haven't watched it. I haven't watched it in a long time, so maybe I'm due for a Zodiac rewatch.
It's really nice. I really enjoyed it. That was a you recommendation. That's why I watched it.
Oh yeah. That sounds about right. I'm going to go in a different direction again this week. I was thinking it was hard. It was hard to recommend something because the Alto Knights, it just didn't inspire any like natural, oh, this reminds me of, kind of films. So I wanted to keep it similar lengthwise because the Alto Knights, it is a tight 2 hours. And I'm going to recommend a crime film from 2016. Well, really more of a neo-Western. And I'm recommending Hell or High Water. You ever see this film?
No, I never have.
So it's directed by David Mackenzie, and it's written by Taylor Sheridan, who created Yellowstone, who wrote Sicario,
I like
a bunch of other movies.
Yep.
Yeah, he loves his Westerns. And it's a small scale.
I also love Westerns.
Well, sure, who doesn't? It's a small scale neo-Western, like crime drama starring Chris Pine and Ben Foster as these 2 brothers, one of whom is a single dad, the other is an ex-con, and they basically start robbing banks to... whatever. Why does one rob banks for money? I guess. Yep. Yeah, to save their family ranch. And while they're doing that, they're pursued by 2 Texas Rangers, one of whom is played by Jeff Bridges. And so it's just in the way that like the Alto Knights, it was refreshing to watch because it's a film that's meant for adults. And I think it fails in a lot of ways, but it's nice where it's just like you're watching a film and it's not trying to pepper in, quippy one-liners or stupid jokes or like add a bunch of CGI bullshit. It's just, this is a little crime film about like a real thing and it's made for adults. Hell or High Water is that kind of film where it's less than 2 hours long. It's smartly written. It's well directed. The performances by Bridges and Pine and Foster are great. And it's a really nice little film.
Yeah, it's on my watch list.
Yeah.
So it already was. You were describing it, and I was like, oh, this sounds really nice. Like I'm going to go to Letterboxd and add this to my watch list, but it was already there. So
there we go.
I need to move it up in the priority list, I guess, because I have 300 films on my watch list, and I don't know. It must be far down on the list because I don't remember having seen it at any point in the past few months when I've like gone to my watch list to try to find something to watch. So I'm gonna move this one up. I'm gonna make a point to watch it over the next few weeks. Sounds awesome.
It's time for us to move to letters. We have one from friend of the podcast, Haley, about our Godsend episode. She writes, Dear Mike and Mike, I'm so glad that Mike brought up, I fucking hate this bit where we don't like distinguish who we are. She says, Dear Mike and Mike, I'm so glad that Mike brought up Hereditary at the end of your episode about Godsend, because the whole time when Mike was talking about not liking horror movies, I was thinking about Hereditary and Midsommar. I love watching scary movies with jump scares for a fun time, but those 2 movies are truly horrifying. For something to respond to, What is your favorite and least favorite genre of movie? You can only pick one for each. Love you both, Haley. P.S. My dumbass sent this to our hero Dinero at gmail.com first, which isn't a valid email, but maybe there's a market out there for starting a podcast about the Mexican peso with that name. Interesting question. Yeah, it's a good joke. Good letter, Haley. Thank you for writing in. I just want to say, first of all, I do think Hereditary is good. It's not my cup of tea necessarily, but Midsummer bored the shit out of me. If it wasn't so fucking bright, I probably would have fallen asleep the 2 times that I've watched it.
We've watched that twice in the past year, too.
Twice, right? Man. Because the first time I watched it.
We sat down to watch it. Yep, like here, right? At my house.
Yeah, at your house.
It was in IMAX like 4 months later, and we had to watch it again.
You had to do it again. Yep. The director's cut even longer.
I, too, do not love Midsummer. But I will say, like, it looks incredible. That's just
it's a good looking film. Good looking film
to watch. Ari Aster, he has such a distinctive visual style, and it's really cool how different Hereditary and Midsummer look from each other. But like they both look great. Like,
absolutely,
it's really cool. Yeah, he's really good. He's really good. If you like that kind of thing.
But this is an interesting question. What is your favorite and least favorite genre of movie? Let's start with least favorite. Does one come to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean it's horror. I don't like horror movies. Like, and I especially don't like jump scare horror movies. Like that's not fun to me. I like Hereditary because I think Hereditary, the way that it is scary, is really gets under your skin. You know, it's scary because of the things that it makes you think about and reflect on. There are very few jump scares in the film, and like I don't love Hereditary because I too find it a little bit boring. But I think that it also succeeds in that way. Like the horror is like
Midsummer or Hereditary.
Oh, Midsummer. Sorry, did I say Hereditary again?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was talking about Midsummer in the second part. Like the way that it is scary is in like making you think about the things that are happening and like what they mean, and the fact that it's able to be scary in spite of being like the brightest fucking movie ever recorded is a testament to like how much more interesting that style of scaring you is than like putting like scary shit on the screen that appears really quickly. So yeah, that would probably be my least favorite. What about you?
You know, I think about it, it's tough because like in terms, I was thinking about this when I read the letter, and in terms of what I watched the least, it would probably be romance films. But I have nothing against them. I have no beef with romance films. I just never, and I mean never, watch them. So
I like them.
I'm sure they're fine. It's just I have no interest. So I guess I would also say horror films because there are so many bad ones. You know, horror, it's the genre where you can make horror films very cheaply, and they can do great financially because you can get such a big multiplier if your budget is $5-10 million. So they pump them out. There's just a constant stream of them. And I think more so than other genres, or maybe I just notice it more, there's just a lot of cheap bullshit in the genre. And it really turned me off of the entire genre for a long time, just thinking that it's all like cheap, jump scary nonsense. And it's really not the case. I've been enjoying watching horror films the last couple of Octobers, but it's because I'm like really selecting the best of the best, and I'm enjoying those experiences. What about your most favorite? Yeah. That's so hard.
I will say, like, kind of to your comment, I think that all horror films, like my senses, have gotten worse over the past couple of years. And, even friend of the pod, Hannah, my sister, has remarked to me, over the past few months, we've talked about movies that Blumhouse, which is like, it's a very beloved, like, small horror film distributor. Yeah. Like, even their stuff, especially over the past year, has gotten terrible. Like, it's like they're just, like, churning out, like, these relatively low-budget things. And, like, to your point, it's because they don't have to make money. It's like, if you can make, like, 10 films for $4 million each, it's like you only need one to make $100 million.
Exactly.
And, like, that,
I mean, it's
that's not even that much. So it's like, works from a business perspective, but it just like saturates the market with a bunch of BS that isn't very good. And it's, I don't know. We've talked about this before, and I'm sure we will continue to dig into it over the next couple of years that we're doing this. But like the current economics and business model of like filmmaking is like fucking grim. And it certainly is not going to get any better, because for all of the all of the ways that I think large language models and AI technology are going to improve a lot of parts of society over the next several years, the creative parts of society are not going to be one of those things. And I think that as there are more ways that studios can save a buck by like automating a bunch of shit, like decision making and like creation and stuff like that, like, I don't know how you can stop it from happening practically, to be honest. So I try not to think about it, but like, it does suck. It's not going to be good. The changes that these things are going to augur over the next few years. My favorite genre, I guess this is so unspecific. I don't really know like how to get more specific than this, but you know, like I like feelingsy dramas, you know. Oh, yeah. I like meetings movies and
meetings movies are great.
You know, yeah, I like primarily things where like people are just having conversations that are kind of really kind of full with subtext. And yeah, I don't know how to get more specific than that, I guess. I don't know. Do you think there's a way to get more specific about what my favorite genre of film is? I'm really struggling with this. I'm like looking at my like top rated films and it's like, that's the through line, I guess, but that's not really a genre. That's more of like a vibe, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I think of like meetings movies of like, I think about like Moneyball and Tar and those sorts of films, which I love. So I don't know if I'd call it my favorite, yep. But I get what you're saying. I think for me, it's so hard to pick because there are a few genres that I really love, and meetings movies are definitely one of them. But I think I just have to go with sci-fi. I need to be true to myself. You know, I'm a Star Wars. I used to be a Star Wars head before that franchise went to shit, with the exception of Andor. I still am
a Star Wars head for like a fifth of it. You know, like I'm a Star Wars head about like a fifth of the things. Like, yeah.
Oh my God. But like, you know, I'm just thinking about just. So many great sci-fi films that have inspired my imagination over the course of my movie watching life. Everything from Star Wars to The Matrix to Blade Runner and its sequel, just the Aliens franchise. You know, half of it, the half that's good. We need more Robert De Niro sci-fi. Where the fuck is that?
Sci-fi is nice when it's good. You know, the problem is that much like horror, you know, I think that it's relatively cheap to produce. It doesn't have a lot of cachet. Kind of in the
that is a problem.
And so you get a lot of schlock, right? I mean, it's like it's cheap to do bad sci-fi, and bad sci-fi works, I think, content-wise, or bad CGI works, I think, content-wise, like better in sci-fi than it does in many other genres, and so you get a lot of that garbage. It's kind of similar to horror in that way. Like, bad special effects are cheap, right? Like, you can get that shit out there, and it'll work on a lot of people.
Yeah, so there you go, Haley. Thanks for writing in. Appreciate that. Look at that. Great letter. From the listeners, from the citizens of De Niro Nation. Yeah,
I agree. Yep.
You remember, if you want to email us, that is ourherodeniro@gmail.com. And normally we would move into the role here, but this episode is out of sequence. So we're going to be back next week with Meet the Parents. That's going to be a big one. I'm excited about that. Talking about a big De Niro hit from the year 2000. Yep. We'll be back next week talking about Gaylord Fokker and the Circle of Trust. But I think it's time for us to listen, man. That was comedy in the year 2000.
The Circle of Trust is legitimately pretty funny.
Yeah, right? It is pretty good.
I was laughing at the Circle of Trust. The Circle of Trust is pretty funny.
I'm laughing at it all, man. That movie it's going to be a laugh riot, I'm sure. So we'll be back next week to talk about that, and I think we can wind it down now. So I'd like to take a moment to thank the citizens of De Niro Nation for listening, as always. Please do follow us on Letterboxd. I'm Mike back at you. He's Mike the Fab. And again, email us at ourherodeniro@gmail.com. Want to thank Caroline for the podcast artwork, and rate us in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever weird app you use to listen to podcasts. And we'll be back next week with Meet the Parents on another episode of Our Hero De Niro.
Bye, De Niro Nation.